All right, everyone. Well, welcome. My name is Laura Wood. I am Vice President for Democracy with Local Policy Lab, which is a program of the National Civic League, where I serve as Director of Local Government Strategy. And my colleague Nick Vlaus and I put together this democracy conversation today. We're really excited to have so many people participating and such wonderful speakers. I think you're all in for a really big treat. And so I will keep this as short as possible so that we can turn to our wonderful speakers. We decided to convene this conversation today because, we're always thinking about ways to strengthen democracy, particularly at the local level. And we know that there's a lot of really great work happening in local governments throughout the country, and certainly more work to be done. And we're hoping today to kind of bring economic policy into the conversation, because for so many people, the economy is really directly related to how folks can participate, whether they can participate, and how people can show up in their communities. And so we invited this really esteemed panel to help us dive into that issue. We're hoping today we have a couple of learning objectives today. First of all, to sort of recognize how economic institutions do influence civic participation and trust, to identify some economic policy levers that local governments control, to kind of talk through what are some practical steps to actually strengthen democracy through economic decisions at the local level. And Nick will get into a bit more detail about that in just a minute. I just wanted to very briefly introduce our panelists before turning it over to him, and we will share their fuller bios in the chat. But we are welcoming today Selena Sue, who is the inaugural Marilyn Gittell Chair in Urban Studies at the Grad Center of the City University of New York, and a professor of political science at Brooklyn College, which is part of the City University system. Her work focuses on everyday struggles for collective governance and centers economic democracy and racial justice. She has a new book out called Budget Justice on Building Grassroots Politics and Solidarities. And we will share details about how you can get your hands on that shortly. We are also joined today by Leonard Brock, who is the Vice President of Learning and Impact Issues at Community Foundation's Leading Change, otherwise known as CF Leads. He's been at CF Leads since May 2020 and leads their economic mobility action network by facilitating shared learning and understanding and identifying content expertise to help deepen the knowledge of participants and create a safe space for community foundations to learn from each other as they work to advance economic mobility in their communities. And finally, and forgive me if I mispronounce anyone's name, Joe Guinan is president of the Democracy Collaborative. He focuses on political economy, strategy, and economic systems change, and is co-author of several books and many, many, many articles. He's a former journalist, and I'll let him share more when it's his turn to speak. So with that, I will pass it over to Nick to kick things off.
Amazing. Thanks for that intro. Welcome, everyone. Nick Vlaus. I'm the managing director of the Center for Democracy Innovation. Political economy, and specifically the political economy of democratic innovation, is something that's very near and dear to my heart. I write a lot about this. And so I'm really excited to kickstart this conversation. Conversations about democracy and civic participation, very specifically these two, this sort of world that we're part of, coming from this angle, tend to really focus on political institutions and political behavior and connect that to, challenges or declining democracy and various struggles. So how do we increase trust? How do we reduce polarization? How do we improve engagement and things like that? And these are important questions, and I think these should be questions that we actively try to solve. But we want to explore this in unison or in conversation with the economy. So our democratic challenges are not only rooted in political institutions, and not only by solving political institutional challenges can we deal with these democratic crises, but in the economic conditions and economic institutions that shape people's capacity to participate, as Lord mentioned. So people don't participate in civic life in a vacuum. Their ability to participate is shaped by whether they have economic security, opportunity, mobility, time, access to institutions that influence public decisions. Communities experiencing economic decline often experience civic decline as well. So places with civic infrastructure that's strong often have social and economic outcomes that are different. The relationship runs both ways. At the same time, many decisions we classify as economic are also democratic. So decisions about housing, budgets, procurement, workforce development, public assets, community wealth shape how and who has voice, agency, and influence. So the purpose of today is not to collapse democracy into economics or vice versa. We want to explore the relationship. So we want to move beyond thinking solely about participation as only a communications and political institutional challenge, and thinking about economic decision making beyond that as strictly growth in GDP. So basically, how this is going to work is I'm going to throw out a provocation, and each of the speakers is going to take a few minutes to respond to that. We're going to move into a moderated discussion and leave a little bit of time for a Q&A at the very end, so you can put questions into the chat, and we'll encourage people to come on screen and ask the questions as well. So the main question we want everyone to address right now is we often treat economic policy and democratic participation as separate domains. What do we miss when we do that? So we'll start off with Leonard and then go to Selena and Joe. You take it from there, Leonard.
Thanks, Nick. And I think in your preface, you laid it out perfectly. And just to provide some contextual remarks before I actually dive right into the question, I'm going to approach this from a very pragmatic perspective and share a very practical lens. Now, when I was thinking about this webinar, I could triangulate and speak from an academic lens. I could speak from a theoretical lens, and I think that's going to be covered. So, what I'll say in answering that question directly, Nick, is that you can't untether the two. They work hand in glove. And I think by bifurcating democracy from economic mobility or security does a disservice for a host of different reasons. When I was going over some very rudimentary talking points, there's a few through lines that came up in conversation with self. And it's often, we don't often ask why people don't participate, or we ask the question often, I'm sorry, why people don't participate, why they don't vote, why they don't attend meetings from a democratic perspective. But it's a natural response when the engagement from the practitioner or the person that is deeply involved or most affected doesn't have a trusting relationship with the entities or the institutionalized efforts that promise one thing and may not always deliver. So what I had wrote down is that democracy is not merely something people vote in. Democracy is something people are able to participate in, and that participation depends on power, opportunity, stability, and agency, the very things you made reference in your preface. The other thing, too, is that when you think about the economic conditions that we're addressing, in large part, that could be the results of failed democracy or public policy or failed public policy or poor public policy. So it's hard to untether the two without thinking about the institutional levers as well as the people that make up those institutional bodies. So, a few different things I'll share, and I put a pin in my commentary, is that when considering economic gain or when thinking about economic mobility, especially for individuals who may be in need or may be affected with some type of crisis or may be on that trajectory of improving their conditions, you cannot just program your way out of these things, right? So if we're looking at policy, we're looking at democracy, we're looking at these things that will allow for population level outcomes to be achieved. One cannot look at just the individual cases. We have to look at the structure in whole. So democracy becomes infrastructure. The infrastructure becomes the breeding ground for economic outcomes. And another point that I'll like to drive from a practitioner perspective, when I was doing the work in Rochester, New York, I led this anti-poverty effort that was highly politicized and required a significant number of stakeholders. And oftentimes, symbolically, unbeknownst to some of the institutional players, there's very little value placed on differing perspectives or the not so usual suspects. So I think balance becomes one of the things that is paramount as it relates to being able to drive the needle as it relates to democratic outcomes and economic mobility outcomes. But just to simplify my remarks without getting into a triad here, is I would just simply say it as this. You cannot untether the two. It's not a bifurcated issue. It's part of the same system, but the question becomes how to create parallel tracks that inform one and the other, and more importantly, to ensure that there's a continuous closed loop process so it's not done in isolation, but is done obviously in collaboration in support of the North Star. Hopefully that answers the question, Nick. Like I said, I don't want to get too far and get theoretical with it.
I think that's excellent. We'll have more time to discuss in the discussion. So, Selena, feel free.
Thank you so much, Nick, Laura, Leonard, Joe, everyone here. I'm really excited to be here. For me, when we treat economic policy and democratic participation as separate domains, as Leonard already started to discuss, we miss the ways in which our economic policies and public budgets tend to reflect moneyed or corporate interests often or have certain visions of what economic development means. When everyday folks are given the power and resources to inform economic policies, they step up and do so. In my research, I've actually not found people to just be apathetic. This also defies the popular notion that the price of gas is a bread and butter issue, but somehow democracy is not. Authoritarianism and affordability are twinned crises, and they should be addressed together. So there was a famous study a few years ago by the political scientist Martin Gillens and Benjamin Page, who analyzed 1,799 policy decisions in Congress and compared them to the preferences of the public according to public opinion polls and different interest groups. And they concluded that the average American's influence on public policy is quote unquote near zero. Um, this suggests that we can't rely on electoral democracy or what social scientists call um, liberal representative democracy to by itself build a truly better future and better economic policies for us. So a liberal democracy emphasizes elected representatives, individuals, and procedural justice. Um, and it's always done so by excluding some people from becoming full citizens, enslaved people, women, those unable to pay poll taxes, undocumented immigrants, those poor enough to seek shelter or not have a permanent address. Um, and this also going to into the voting booths by ourselves as individuals and not working collectively also makes the public easy to divide and conquer. And amid an awful affordability crisis, it's then easier for politicians to pit different constituencies against each other. So, what would it mean to build collective practices that help the public turn from us versus them thinking to a broader we? Actually, in the US, participatory democracy is not a betrayal, but at its roots. When the framers wrote the Constitution, the Haudenosaunee, called the Iroquois by the French, already were invited by Benjamin Franklin to the Continental Congress, and they talked to them about participatory democracy. The framers took their federalist design and their bundle of arrows metaphor, but not the participatory democracy part. And it doesn't have to be this way. So I ended up studying participatory budgeting, in which everyday folks help to allocate a portion of public funds. And in Brazil, and it's not just it doesn't have to be like a cute side exercise. In Brazil, cities that had it achieved 16% more in tax revenues because when people know where their taxes are going, they're willing to pay more. They develop more civil society organizations than the cities without PB and boasted of results like lowering infant mortality. Um, and I'll say that finally, on a related note, direct democratic experiments like these have to be done well and stay connected to the grassroots. I'll just give a couple of quick facts about the New York, one of the New York versions. The older New York one, which was run by the city council, when we did 51,000 surveys, one out of every four people who participated were not eligible to vote in regular elections. Again, when they feel like they can make a difference, they step up. Those who participated, especially those from lower income backgrounds, were 8% more likely to vote in regular elections. And they had a lot of spillover effects where they pressed for subway reforms, or they pressed for bathrooms lines in the regular city budget beyond the participatory budgeting process. So um, they work together. Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks for that. Joe?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. And thank you especially to the National Civic League for hosting this conversation. I really want to recommend the essay that Nick wrote on these themes. I found that really helpful in framing it all. And thanks to Leonard and Selena for their remarks. There's going to be a lot of agreement on this panel. So I'm going to zoom out to the level of the political economy as a whole. And let me be really blunt in answering this question. This notion that the economy and democratic politics are separate spheres is a recent innovation. We can trace it to the birth of neoliberalism in the post-war era. It's not a notion that would be recognized by the classical political economists like Adam Smith. And it's also a notion that is in the process of collapse at the moment with the end of the economic growth, I think, that people have taken for granted as part of that, but also because the pattern of political economy it produces is causing all sorts of difficulties, right? So quite simply, and the data show this, and I just dropped a link to our index of systemic trends in the chat, virtually all the gains to the economy for an extended period now, half a century, have gone to the very top. And that is just simply not sustainable democratically for at least two reasons. First, it creates a class of billionaire plutocrats who are able to buy democracy for their own purposes. And we see this in the current looting and pillaging phase of plutocracy in Washington. And second, you can't run an economy in which all the gains go to the top and the rest are left struggling for a long period without experiencing popular political backlash. And that's a big part of why we're currently in what has been termed an age of anger. All around the world, especially here in the United States at the moment, there's this deep and abiding sense of economic dispowerment which has taken hold, producing a kind of boiling anger among voters at a system that they see that is stacked against them. And because of that, something has to give. Words that are often attributed to US Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis capture this. He said, we can have a democratic society or we can have the concentration of great wealth in the hands of a few. We cannot have both. So that's to put it negatively. Let's turn it around. Let's put it positively. The solution to the problem of plutocracy and democratic backsliding today is not to be found separate from the economy, but at least in part is to be found in the economy, in the expansion of economic democracy, what we like to call the democratic economy. We need to provide people with a greater stake, a greater say, a greater sense of control and purpose, not just in democratic politics, but in economic life. And this is not a super familiar way of thinking for a lot of people. We're familiar with one person, one vote, substantive political equality in the democratic realm. We don't tend to think in the same way in the economy, which is still in some ways a realm of autocracy and absolutist power in economic relations. And when we thought of tempering that overweening power of capital in the economy, typically we have a conversation about labor unions, right, which are now at historic lows in the United States, below 6% union density in the private sector. Unions no longer offset the power of capitalists through collective bargaining in the way that they used to. I'm very much in favor of rebuilding labor union power, but let's not pretend that that is happening in a way that's actually going to change the patterns of the economy overall. After all, this past week, we just saw the minting of our first trillionaire. The direction of travel is obvious, right? What we need to do in response is to bring greater democracy to the economy through greater participation, control, and distribution. And we do that through the creation of broad-based economic ownership. The most people have assets in the form of their home, maybe a little bit of pension wealth. This is also under threat and declining. What if there were far greater ownership by ordinary people of productive wealth and assets in the economy, a democratic economy that underpins a democratic society? And that might sound like a bit of a pipe dream, but actually it isn't. But it does require us to shift the way that we think about the economy. What if each day when we woke up, we could know for sure that we were waking up to an economy that was automatically getting better for everyone, right? Somehow we've grown so used to the way that things are at the moment that we've forgotten how to imagine that such an economy is even possible. But we can imagine it and we can build it together. This would be a moral economy, a democratic economy. Finance in such an economy would be put back in service of people, communities, and the planet. In this economy, we see labor raised up above capital. Good, decent work would be a core social aim and source of individual development. Ownership wouldn't be concentrated, but it'd be broad-based and widely held. Stewardship would be the basis of ownership rather than exploitation. It'd be a real, not a financialized economy. All economic activity, that means, would be in real places, and communities would be able to take control of their own destinies. It'd be a collaborative economy in which human flourishing occurs in healthy communities and a livable planet. We've forgotten how to hope and demand. This economy is hard to imagine in some ways because we've impoverished our imaginations. And as a result, we can't imagine such an economy that when we wake up each day, we would know that in and of itself, the economy was going to produce better outcomes, greater equality, more democracy, healthier people and communities, a cleaner environment. The good news is people are already building such an economy. The exciting thing to me about economic democracy and the democratic economy is that it isn't a pipe dream. It's already emerging all around us as a spontaneous response that people, ordinary people in their communities, have to social pain. They've been let down by traditional policies and which have failed them, and as a consequence, they're turning to economic alternatives in which new wealth is being built collectively and from the bottom up. And at the Democracy Collaborative, we call this community wealth building. And I guarantee that if you put on the lenses of community wealth building and look around you, at least a third of your local economy is already potentially susceptible to democratic direction and control. Local government, K through 12 education, universities and hospitals and large place-based anchor institutions, cultural institutions, non-profits, public and union pension funds, the social economy of need and care, social enterprises, co-ops, worker ownership. And by the way, there are already more worker owners in America than there are members of unions in the private sector. This is democratic collective capital. Add it all together, manage it democratically, and you already have the basis for a very different pattern of political economy than billionaire or even trillionaire plutocracy. And as such an economy is developed, it's going to produce very different political outcomes through democratic politics. Thank you.
Well, that's an excellent set of answers to the provocation. I think that really kickstarts, part of the moderated discussion. I hope a lot of questions from you in the gallery are percolating, and you can start thinking about what you want to ask our panelists. I think we're doing pretty decent here for our moderated discussion, so I think we could probably make our way through maybe even two of the questions. So, but I'll start with, the real practical question here, because I think one of the things is we do want a takeaway for practitioners, whether you're working for a local government or a government agency or a public sector agency or an NGO or the like. So, if a local government wanted to take one meaningful step in the next year to better connect economic policy to democratic participation, where should they start? And feel free, all three, to jump in as you see fit.
Shall I speak, or do you want to go first, Selena? I was just talking.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. I will say that since I focus on public budgets, I'll just say that I try to if for the book that Lauren shared the information of, I try to wade through the New York City budget, which is like 500 or 600 pages of PDFs, and just to show that that's not just a New York City thing. I've met people from a whole lot of different cities now, including a community organizer from Birmingham, Alabama, who calls PDFs pretty damn fucked, and a doctoral student who's studying city budgets, and I think half of the budgets for the most 100 most populous city for the 100 most populous cities in the US, I guess have their budgets in PDF form so that they're not even in CSV form so that we can do really basic number crunching. When I waded through the um, some of the police numbers had new lines for patrol that were $2 billion that didn't have last year's numbers. So I'm not talking about super fancy regression analyses. I'm talking about basics. So one basic thing is trying to make city budgets accessible, transparent, legible, and comparable. Like if we could have last year's numbers or some unit that's relatable. The official term is units of appropriation, like not just the city number, but the neighborhood number or the school-based number. That would be huge. And I'll say one more practical thing, which is to just hold a few more conversations, assemblies, call them whatever you want, where people are not just giving 2-minute speeches that are pre-prepared in often antagonistic ways, but actually talk to one another. And especially people unlike ourselves beyond friendly banter at the local bodega or cafe. People, when they're talking face to face, tend to not troll one another or have the keyboard courage they have online. I've witnessed hundreds of these assemblies, and listen to their priorities, and then try to change one routine economic policy based on those priorities. Like Mamdani just tried to balance this year's budget by delaying payments to nonprofits that were originally due on July 1st. And nonprofits had to threaten these are nonprofits that serve the neediest in New York. And they had to threaten a protest this week in order for him to scrap that idea. Meanwhile, the Atlantic Yards project near me is supposed to pay $2,000 a month in fines for each affordable housing apartment they didn't build, and they haven't built 876. This would be millions of fines we could collect, and we haven't collected a cent. So if we know that people want housing and services for the needy, let's not make them figure out the technical details. Let's listen to the priorities and change something that government already does towards those priorities.
And Joe, I'm not sure if you wanted to. Okay. I kind of paused and wanted to reflect before responding to the question, Nick. And thank you, Selena, because you offered perspective I needed to hear before responding because I didn't want to sound like a cynic, with my very first comment out the gate. Um, Government oftentimes know what to do. That doesn't necessarily imply that they're doing what they know to be the right thing to do. And again, I'm not going to frame this as a cynic, but I would say like budgets are moral documents. I'm pretty sure you've heard that. I want to say I'm stealing that from Martin Luther King. And there are a plethora of ways that government could engage folks from an economic perspective to participate in democracy. And I'll share just one or two practical ways. And before doing so, I think public will becomes the real question for me. Is there enough public will to do what's necessary to drive change in these areas? And I'm not suggesting that there isn't any public will. I'm not suggesting that everyone may see it from that particular vantage point. But if we were to look at budget as moral documents, the point Selena made reference in terms of transparency and being able to showcase how dollars are being spent, I would say procurement is one of the areas of opportunity for a lot of local governments in terms of like how and where they're leveraging contracts. And I was thinking about a project that I was working on in Rochester, and it was modeled after a co-op in Cleveland with their hospital system, but governments could do something very similar to that. And those opportunities are very low-hanging fruit, doesn't really require much change, but then again, it becomes a question of public will. And then there's other opportunities too, even when you think about tax abatements for first-time business owners, and it doesn't have to be permanent, or we talk about homeowners, but there's a number of different things, even first right of refusal as it relates to different land banks. There's so many different opportunities that is not a question of like what are the things that can be done, but what are the levers that's preventing it from happening? Like what really is preventing the things we know to be true or that could serve this particular purpose? What's preventing it from actually happening? But I'll just posit those things. Like I said, I don't want to get on a soapbox, but I just wanted to offer that commentary.
Yeah, thanks, Leonard. And so, again, agree with everything you're saying. Maybe just to build upon the idea that once we've got transparency and we know what people want, where we go next, one thing that could be a bold overnight thing that would make a real difference would be what if we shifted all economic development spending by local governments, which is already considerable, in the direction of building this kind of more community-based economy of broad ownership that we need as part of revitalizing democracy? Because under the present local economic development paradigm, what we basically do is put cities and states in competition with each other for jobs and investment in the context of a kind of corporate locational blackmail or extortion exercise where a zero sum or even negative sum game plays out, right? Which is hugely beneficial to the corporations that receive a lot of the economic development spending as subsidies and incentives, but it's far less beneficial for the localities and ordinary people. And we saw a version of this in that egregious race to the bottom a few years ago of corporate subsidies that was unleashed by Amazon announcing that they were going to have a competition for placing their second corporate headquarters. And that was an extreme version of what is basically the conventional economic development model that requires very large amounts. I've seen numbers around $100,000 in taxpayer-funded inducements per job created under the current paradigm. And of course, these aren't new jobs at all. They're jobs that existed somewhere else that are then poached as part of this game. And then when the subsidies expire, the game is played out all over again with a new city as the victim of a corporate shakedown. So what if instead of spending all this money on corporate subsidy farming and smokestack chasing, what if instead all economic development funds by local government were repurposed to build the kind of local democratic economies that we want to see instead? Every dollar currently going to corporate welfare instead could support local businesses, especially co-ops and other democratic businesses, and could go towards building a recirculatory local economy of economic multipliers. Be a huge first step. We could build in some of the participatory decision making that Selena was talking about and the purpose that Leonard was talking about. It's our money already, so we should use it to build a democratic economy locally and regionally instead of just wasting it on building plutocratic and corporate wealth.
Excellent. I think that segues nice the way you're talking about economic development to think about another question, which is how might our economic priorities or how might our economic policies or measures of success look different if democratic participation were built into them from the beginning?
Maybe I'll say that based on the assemblies I got to watch, um, it, people do start to imagine differently, and they um, and sometimes people don't have the vocabulary. I'm not sure in New York that the term solidarity economy is as commonplace popular as I would like it to be. Sometimes I talk to people and I'm like, oh, you mean something like the solidarity economy or like a worker cooperative. Um, but people do end up working in cooperation rather than competition. And I'll say that a lot of people who participated in local participatory budgeting said that they were trained to work in a capitalist economy and for competition to write personal statements, to write job cover letters, and that they weren't used to figuring out and learning how to cooperate with one another, even though there are so many existing exercises like carpools instead of calling an Uber, for instance, that people have referenced are already part of economic activity all around us. I'll just say like one example is there was an assembly where someone from the wealthier Upper West Side came to an assembly in the lower income East Harlem, and he was like, "Oh, I was gonna come here for my kid's school, but you're senior citizens in public housing and you need laundry machines. I'm actually gonna take back my project and help you with yours." And people drew upon local knowledge. Youth who were dismissed at first by the grown-ups in the room were like, "Oh, this specific block feels unsafe in the after school hours." When people can draw upon local knowledge alongside technical knowledge, when they can talk to one another, they were also interested in stuff that the technical experts in the room hadn't thought about. They didn't guess that local middle schoolers and high schoolers would have asked for a housing policy lab to learn about community land trusts as a winning project in local participatory budgeting. That local families and domestic workers, nannies and home health aides would have wanted to come together for community agreement on what decent wages are beyond what's already in the law books. So those are just a couple examples of how I came to better appreciate how important the solidarity economy was through learning about the ideas that people really wanted to try if they had the resources to do so.
And Nick, I'm gonna try to approach it. Thanks, Selena. Nick, I'm gonna try to answer the question, and not to oversimplify, but hopefully it answers the question. So, if the democratic process if democracy is considered at the front end of some type of economic mobility strategy, I'm just loosely framing this, I think there would be a better understanding of the outcomes, not in terms of causation, but correlation. And things that are oftentimes minimized will be strongly considered because it's not always the destination as much as it is the journey that will shape the ultimate sustained outcomes. So I look at it from the perspective of measuring process indicators that could lead to systems change that ultimately could lead to population level outcomes. If the democratic process is engaged on the front end of an economic strategy, I know I'm paraphrasing, this is not exactly how you frame the question, I will look at the systems change model. So if there's an iceberg and what's beneath the surface are the mental models, the relationships and social capital before you get at the structures and the things that are visible for people to kind of see the outcomes or the deliverables associated with any particular effort. But what goes underneath are the things that oftentimes get overlooked. So I always say that this is a work of it's a hard science, but it's also a soft art. And by separating the two, you may not always get the most holistic, sustained outcome, but there's fragments. And I think putting those fragments together is part of what we're trying to do, even in some of these conversations now. But if it's on the front end, I think it just becomes part of the actual journey and it becomes part of having a holistic approach prior to trying to put the fragmented pieces together. So that's just a response to the question, if that speaks directly to um, the question itself.
Yeah, thanks, Leonard. When I think about an economy capable of supporting a democratic politics, I think that unavoidably takes us to the question of economic ownership. I've been talking a little bit abstractly, so let's do a little story about community wealth building in Cleveland, Ohio, as my response to what this might look like. So, those of you who know Cleveland, it was facing a lot of economic challenges, lost half its population. Most of the Fortune 500 companies that were located there left, deindustrialization, disinvestment, capital flight, white flight. But it also still had these very large nonprofit quasi-public institutions located in the city: Cleveland Clinic, Case Western Reserve University, university hospitals, which we call anchor institutions because they're rooted in place and they're not likely to get up and leave. And together, these institutions, which of course themselves are largely dependent on flows of public funds and favorable tax treatment, were spending billions of dollars per year, and very little of it was remaining in the local community. So we work with the anchors, the city, the Cleveland Foundation, to pursue a strategy to localize their procurement in support of a network of purposely created worker co-ops that would be tied together in a community corporation. These included actually an industrial scale, ecologically advanced laundry, since laundries were mentioned. And recently they've added a fund to pursue employee ownership conversions of existing businesses. And these companies aren't easily sold outside of the network without the permission of the community. They return a percentage of their profits to develop additional worker-owned firms. And in this way, they grow the local economy, right? And through such strategies, what we can start to do is keep money circulating locally rather than being extracted. We can anchor jobs, we can build community wealth, we can reverse long-term economic decline. And today, the Evergreen story is a success story. These companies are profitable. They're competing with the big multinational corporations that have previously provided all those contract services to the big anchor institutions. Evergreen is owned by its employees, the vast majority of whom are Black, many returning citizens, most of whom live in historically underserved and under-resourced neighborhoods. And Evergreen is now the second largest, minority-owned business in Northeast Ohio. Recently, they beat out the large multinational corporation Sodexo to secure the full laundry contract for the Cleveland Clinic, took over the existing plant, hired all of Sodexo's former employees on a living wage, and offered them a fast track to employee ownership. And this kind of begins you to thinking differently about intervention in the economy and how we can go about creating a different model of recirculation with different public policies and a different way of thinking about how capital should flow, how it should stick, who should own it, who should control it, and what the forms might be that best serve the healthy, flourishing communities that we need as part of democracy.
It's excellent. So I think what we want to do now is turn to the audience for questions. Feel free to ask a question in the chat, or we also encourage you to maybe just put your hand up and then you can just ask your question, just come on screen and ask your question. Looks like Doug has a question here. Local elected leaders benefit from the trickle-down approach of luring new companies given new companies, given this dynamic, how do we infuse democracy to change this approach?
I mean, there's an old adage of the community organizing movement in the United States, which is if you can't change your leaders, change your leaders. And at some point, actual formal economic democracy kicks in if our local representatives are not representing us and building the kind of models that we want to see.
Any other, feel free to ask any other questions or Jessica, jump on in.
Hi. Yeah, I asked this question in the chat, but I thank you so much as someone who works in this field of community wealth building and community investing, and also just wrote a Master of Divinity thesis around spirituality and economy. It all resonates very much. I'd love to hear a little bit more about how I think we do have some great models out there. We have some great structures, technical solutions, but how do we change the imagination? And I think the real fear that lurks in people's minds when we're asking them to, detach from a way of operating that is very broken and people sense that, but it's also, it's so embedded with who we are collectively as a people, and what we think success is in the world. So I'd love to just hear your thoughts on how we really get at those underlying shifts.
That's a really good question. And there's a lot of language around hope or belonging. But let me just go directly to the question, Jessica. I am of the belief that the mental model has to shift in order for the outcome. And I think it requires some discomfort. There's an old adage that I don't necessarily subscribe to that says if you want a person to change their psyche, there's two things that will allow for that to happen: spirituality slash religion in crisis. And I don't necessarily know if I subscribe to it, but it was an interesting thought, right? But I believe there's more to unpack as it relates to how we are more connected universally in using your language, even spiritually, than we are divided. And I think until we actually get to the underlying causes for the separation and division, and we continue to approach things from a fragmented psyche, we're going to always yield fragmented outcomes. So I think the people problem is the institutional problem, and I think the solution is one and the same. So the only thing I could simply say about that is we have to continue to question ourselves. And there's like six questions I'll pose, and then I'll like again, I want to keep talking here. Six questions that guide me, that could guide others, and could lead to a solution for the question is who am I? Am I who I say who I am? Am I all that I should be? Why am I here? Where am I going? And how will I know when I arrive? Those are real fundamental questions that guide me and I think could guide anyone that's looking to go along that journey.
Yeah, I love this question. I also love Leonard's answers and his questions there. For me, and I don't really like this, but the all the evidence shows that we actually, if we change behavior, but that leads to changes in our mental models. It's not the other way around, which, despite being a child of the Enlightenment, I would like to think it was the other way around. It doesn't seem to be that way. So, part of the answer, I think, in this realm of building a new economy is connecting to existing understanding that people have and getting them to act on that and then fully recognize what it is that they're doing. And there's an enormous amount to build on already. 1 in 3 Americans is in a co-op of one way, shape, or form, right? Some of that's community supported agriculture. Over 100 million people are in credit unions, right? They're not thinking in terms of that as the basis for a different relationship to ownership, to the economy, etc. And so somehow we have to tap into that experience and and demystify what some of these alternatives are in ways that people can get their arms around them and really understand them. them as practical solutions. The other piece of it, though, is linking it to cultural power. I think there's an enormous amount of work that needs to be done around narrative, the arts, and cultural forms. I recently spent back in May a few days in Dublin in Ireland with the Bohemians football team there. Founded in 1890, fan owned as a worker co-op. They've just launched a community wealth building model based around the evergreen co-ops in Cleveland and Mondragon in the Basque region and are really promoting that. But they've got a reach through their fan base and through the way in which they move through the city of Dublin. It's very different than a think tank coming along telling people what it is that we should be doing. So I think we've got to find these new creative cultural ways of popularizing what is actually really common sense existing institutions as the answers to our problems and not some scary abstract thing that's out there.
I love these questions and what everyone has said. To me, it's also important to figure out our non-negotiables as Leonard's questions help, or what some people call non-reformist reforms, because as Leonard's questions help us think through, because we're gonna have to compromise. Not everything will be ideal, but we have to figure out as critical resistance, the group critical resistance asks, will we have to undo this later, or is this a step in the right direction? And the other thing I think about is how to democratize at every scale. Like, in the political science department at Brooklyn College, the dean told us we need asses in classes. We need enrollment numbers to go up, with treating students as paying consumers rather than members of the public to be educated. And we need to compete against adjacent, really connected, departments like sociology. That's ridiculous. So, where are the logics of cooperation and democracy that we can uplift in our tiny nonprofit, in our department, etc., that can serve as foundational building blocks to change bigger institutions?
Excellent question and responses there. I'm mindful here of time, so let's see if we could. We'll try and make our way through these. I noticed a couple of them. You had Holly, Susan, Terry. There was one in the chat, but Holly, did you have a question?
I did, but you basically have answered it, so I'll let the next question.
Susan. You're on mute, Susan. Yeah.
Thank you. Wonderful conversation. My context is I've been a practitioner formerly of public participation, and I won't drag you through the whole thing through every sector, every level of policy. And I landed at community cohesion. And as far as the narrative, I mean, y'all are pointing to wonderful things, but you're still working at the level of institution. And a lot of people refer to social capital as if it's a substance that can be grown or unitized or something. And maybe I'll just take us quickly back to the beginning of the pandemic, where the frontline community members were out doing the thing in between institutional stuff. So I've worked at shareholders inside corporate America. I've worked with stakeholders ad nauseum, and some colleagues here know it's amazing what you can do. But what actually seems to be holding local communities together is the careholders. And some of them are organized in ways that you can see institutionally. But dang, if half, I'm in California, so over half of the folks are economically insecure. So how are they going about their lives? These invisible ways that they're sharing care. They can't afford to pay for all the things of the consumer brain. So participatory budgeting, it's great. But when it came into my community, all it did was just get the local nonprofits competing more. So the informal collaboration. So I'm quite a fan of all these different models. Been there, done that. They each have their benefits. But if you aren't living in a story that we literally are in a community together. So instead of members of the public, are we members of a connected community? And I'm a recovering economist, and Adam Smith didn't really talk too much about invisible hand, but it got picked up because that was kind of handy. But I'm really feeling which of your policies are honoring the invisible heart, because there are unseen people holding your places together. And so I'm not saying don't do these smarty pants institutional things, but if you're not respecting, it's not an iceberg. It truly is a mycelial network between, you're seeing the trees and, those roots and those mycelial network are holding this together. Be careful that your policies aren't just slicing right through that. Is anybody linking the informal community?
I agree with that wholeheartedly, and I won't say too much, but I think it's absolutely critical to engage community, not only formal, but the informal pockets. One of the practices that I always engage in, I call it sidewalk therapy, where because I consider myself an ethnographic scholar practitioner for that reason. I go into the community, learn the community as part of the community, not aside from it. But like I said, we don't have that much time, but I can get into it later. But yes, that's absolutely right.
I'll say that I appreciate Andrea Cornwall's notion framing of invited spaces and how governmental channels and institutions need to become more inviting of democratic participation, but also how we need to pay more attention to less recognized invented spaces, especially the informal ones as well. So I will say that the new Office of Mass Engagement in New York is thinking about how to get to recognize and uplift those sorts of collectives, many of which are anarchist leaning and are going to say, no, we will not be co-opted by the state. That's fine. But these are all really interesting tensions. But and even the book Solidarity Cities, the researchers said, there were a lot of the collectives that were mainly formed by women of color in New York and in other cities were not mappable. Though, so there's a lot of really important infra politics under the radar politics that we need to think about. And going back to Leonard's earlier point, that's also why I do like thinking about democracy as practices and not institutions.
Just very, very quickly on that, I largely agree with you. I think I might try and turn it back round on you a little bit and say that these very mycelial networks and community ties that are what are holding us all together currently have to work against the grain of the existing economy locally, nationally, etc. What we need to do is make sure that they're getting a place to stand economically, and that includes ultimately institutional support and other things that can allow us to build on that basic building block of community as the foundation of the economy. Because going back to the question of this whole webinar, if you can't have little d democracy in your community, then how are you going to have big D democracy in the system as a whole? And I think that's the problem that we're right up against in America and around the world at the moment.
Laura, I think we're at time here. Do you want to just do a quick wrap up?
Yeah, first of all, Terry, I see your hand up, and I would encourage you to write down your question if possible. We will definitely try to respond in writing if folks need to leave. I shared some resources in the chat, but I'm also going to send all of this out after the fact so that you all have them. Leonard, I'm hoping that includes maybe those great questions that you posed. And yeah, I guess I'll just end by thanking Leonard, Selena, and Joe so much for sharing your wisdom and your thoughts, and for everyone for really showing up with great questions and insights. And I wish we had several more hours to talk this through. Maybe we do need to reconvene on this topic sooner rather than later. And we shared some information about how you can keep in touch with us at the League and at Local Policy Lab. So I really hope that you will keep in close touch. And for those of you coming to All America Cities in a few weeks, look forward to seeing you there. But otherwise, hope to cross paths soon. So thank you and have a good rest
Thanks,
of your
everyone.
day.